you're staying with me, we're going back to 2 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter, verses 1 through 3 that we had read earlier today. We're going to be looking at that. So I want you to get there. You can be reading over it while I'm talking to you. In this back-to-school sermon series based on Kevin Cass' devotion book, What's in Your Locker, and if you want one of those, want to use those, we still have a couple of copies out in the foyer, and you can sign up for those. We're sort of recalling some of the things that you might find in an ordinary school locker and how these ordinary things can be used to remind ourselves of God's presence and His activity, our relationship with Him in our lives. And today's object that you might find in a locker is a blank sheet of paper. You may have heard the term tabula rasa. It's bandied about in educational circles. Tabula rasa actually means blank slate in Latin. It originally referred to a tablet that was made of wood, and you'd have these two, kind of like the outside of a book. There were these two little wooden sections, and they would have a lip built on the inside of the edges, and they would just be together. We could close them together, but inside the hollow of where that lip made, they would fill with wax. And the students would have a stylus that they could use to write onto the wax. They were just called a diplet, and because they had two sides. And so they had these wax tablets. And whenever a student was getting ready to go to their class in ancient Rome, they would either scrape it clean or they would heat it and make it clean. And so everything that was previously on there would just disappear because it's wax. And then they would start over and they would work on it. They would practice their writing while they're in classes. They would practice doing their calculations with it. It was so handy, it was even used in the professional world. Let's say, you wanted to calculate, you're a merchant, you want to calculate your supplies. Well, parchment back then was very expensive, and that's what you would keep your long-time records with. And so they would use these wax tablets to do their calculations part on it first, or they would write out what they needed to write to make sure they got it right, or they would write it out and take it to a scribe, and then they would transfer it to something more permanent, and then they could clean that slate and use it again. So before heading to class, these students would have come up with these blank tablets. And that's sort of how students got associated with the idea of a tabula rasa, where they would come in, they had these blank slates, and so they were ready to learn. Tabula rasa, this blank slate idea, is now, for modern educators, the state that they want to achieve with their students when they enter in classes. So they use this to talk about an educational principle. Wouldn't it be great that your students, when they come in, were like a blank slate and ready for you as the teacher to put their lesson on it? But the problem is that students don't show up that way. I mean, when students show up, their tablets are written all over. They've been writing on it over and over and over. And so, it's sort of difficult to put something on something that's already full. And so teachers, usually in the first of their class, do everything they can to help get what these students may have learned about their subject and sort of wipe it away, sort of clean it out of them, so that they can then write their lesson on it. And you may have noticed that the military sort of approaches things this way. They get those new enlistees, they come in, they're like, wow, you come in with all this information, but we want you to do it the military way. And so they sort of do everything they can to sort of wipe them clean so that they can teach them everything they're supposed to do the way they want them to do them. Of course, in an advanced class, let's say you're not your first year, your first student, but you're further along the way, the teachers will probably expect you to show up with some information about the subject, right? If you're taking English, maybe you're the fourth year now, you should have something there. But we know that whenever students return from summer vacation, they often get wiped clean because of the summer activities. And so they show up, instead of having that prior knowledge, they show up sort of like a blank slate. And the teachers are going, I was expecting something to be written on here. So they have to spend the first part of their classes kind of going over basic content to get the students ready to take on that more advanced content. Back to school experiences haven't really changed over the year. So whether you're old and you're remembering a long time ago to your first day of schools, or if you're younger and it was just like this week, you can relate. So here's sort of the scenario that often happens for a student. They walk into their class, first day of school, they find their seat, they want to get there before the bell rings. While they're trying to figure out who is in class with them, they're looking around, seeing where everybody is. Their teacher walks out, sort of introduces themselves and says, okay, everybody get a blank piece of paper out, a pen and a pencil, and get ready. Instantly, as the student in a class like that, you kind of get seized with a little bit of fear, and you say, what's he going to do to us? I mean, what's going to happen here? Is this going to be a pop? Because he hadn't taught us anything. What could it be? Maybe he's just trying to evaluate where we're at with this, whatever he's going there, or, what's going to. But what if this is one of those teachers who delights in making the students look dumb and the teacher look brilliant by testing us on stuff that we don't have any clue that they're talking? You get all of these fears rolling around in your head, and then you finally sort of calm down and you take a deep breath and you say, normal teachers don't really act that way. And so you give it a break, and the teacher just says, okay, I want everyone to start writing. We're going to have a writing time here. And just tell me what you did during your summer vacation. Whew, what a relief. Oh gosh, really, again, summer vacation? Why do teachers do that assignment? I mean, teachers still do that assignment. They've always done that assignment. And it's basically because the teachers are trying to get to know their students. They want to know what they're dealing with. Who are these students? What are their story? What have they been doing? And it also evidences that the students can think for themselves, and they can put ideas together, and they can express it in some written way. And so it helps the teacher make those kinds of evaluations about them. Like everyone in the class, when you have to do that assignment, you just start kind of writing what happened during the summer, right? You might chronicle your family's vacation. You might not get too detailed about it, just where we went, some of the things we did, something nice along the way. You might talk about a trip that the youth troop took, maybe your summer job and some endeavors there. Man, I delivered pizzas all this summer. You might talk about staying up really late and sleeping until the crack of noon. You might lament a little bit about summer break and suggest that it was just too short. I didn't get to do all the things I wanted to. Really, school should not start until after Labor Day. The next thing you know, the teacher's calling for your papers to be turned in. You look down and your blank paper is completely filled up. And you realize, it was really a pretty good summer after all. I had something to write about. This traditional assignment really should make us stop and consider how a teacher is able to write anything on a tablet, a student, that is less than blank. Our tablets, our lives, our hearts are filled up with our experiences. We write on our tablets every moment of every day. Even right now, you're writing on your tablet. We are not tabula rasas. We are not clean slates. And to be honest, most of the stories and most of the stuff we have on our slates are things that we almost wish weren't there. I mean, if people got to read the whole story, we're kind of like, well, there's part of my tablet that's okay for you to read, but there's part of it I really don't want anyone reading. So I keep it hidden. It's on those tablets that we record our experiences and our thoughts and our understandings and our relationships, and they all kind of get mixed together, and they form who we are, and they drive us toward certain behaviors. A lot of them we want everyone to see, but some of them we're kind of ashamed of. Some of them things that we just can't seem to keep from doing, even though we really don't want them to be part of our story. And sometimes we say, when we look at our own tablets, we go, I wish I had a different story. When I look around at the people around me, I think of my life and my story, and it's a mess. I wish I had Jerry's story or Susie's story. When I look at them, they come dressed up, they seem to have it all together. I want an all-together story. And man, my story's like, I don't know, in fact, most of my family got a messed up stories. What can you do when your tablet's full of a messed up story? Students these days are often told that they don't have any choice in the matter about their stories. They are what they are by their DNA. It's programmed them in how they think and what they do, and they have no ability to make any changes in their future in regard to their thoughts and their behaviors. And so everybody's just going to have to accept it because you can't change. And really, it's society that's judging us by telling us that those things are wrong. And we just can't help ourselves. That's the only way we can act. And then we hear the gospel. We hear that we can delete that part of our story that we don't like. And we want that kind of a change in our lives. We're told that when we become a Christian, our old lives will be wiped clean by Jesus. What we once were, at least in regard to our sin and our sin behaviors and our inability to stop sinning, it's going to be separated from us as far as the east is from the west. And we like that idea. It sounds attractive. We're so interested in hearing about this new life we can have, this opportunity of becoming a tabula rasa, something in which we can begin writing a new story, a better story. We hope that could really happen. But we sort of wonder, is it true? Can we really start new? And we're also a little fearful. What if our new story that we start writing just ends up like the old one? What if the gospel wasn't really true? We don't really change. After all, we write on our tablet by our actions and by our words. And if their story in the future is going to be different, there has to be some change, some real change. Those who do take up Jesus' offer to change them, as he promises to do and is able to do. Even when we first change in that, we sometimes are a little hesitant. Well, what if I mess this up? Sometimes it's just because we don't even know what to write on our blank slate. I've never been a Christian before. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to act. I don't know how to behave. Unfortunately, there are often some people around who have been at it for a while, and they give us a little advice, kind of like a teacher to a student. Their counsel and their wisdom, even their admonitions, kind of direct us, and they help us write on those new tablets with good behaviors, different behaviors than we would have done on our own. They help us form new words that lead us into new and better relationships and experiences. And as we have this new story in our life, that story does become, as Paul said, a letter of recommendation for those who discipled us, who taught us. It reflects that their influence was good. Our lives, our tablets should say, hey, if you want to change, like I've changed, then you need to get around these guys. Let me tell you, they're getting it right, and I just sort of did what they were telling me to do, and I'm off in a better direction. It was common back in the early days of the church to move from one community to the next, but not kind of like the way we do it today. Very often, people in the church, they were moving from one church to another because they were being persecuted for their faith. They were in one place and they'd be persecuted, and so they would move to some place hoping they wouldn't be persecuted there. And when they got to that new place, they would look around for a group of believers. And back then, there was usually only like one group in a church, in a town, if there was even one. And when they got together, they would want to try to join in with the church. Some of them, of the churches they left, they might have been leaders in it. And they would show up at these new congregations because of the persecution that sent them packing. And they would want to sort of show up and serve in the same way that they served at the other one. But this new church would be wondering, well, who are you? What gospel do you know? They didn't have a Bible that they could check their teachings to it because that was still being written. And so the early church got in the habit of actually providing some of these people who were moving a letter of recommendation. Hey, when you show up, show them this letter. It will show that you were really who you claim to be, and that you can be trusted, that you really know the right gospel. For example, after the Apostle Paul established the church in Corinth, he was a church planter for the church in ancient Corinth, he had to leave Corinth because he was persecuted. And as he was going, of course, instead of saying, hey, I had to leave town because I'm being persecuted, we just usually refer to that as a missionary journey. But most missionaries aren't sent out because they're trying to leave opposition. But he, on this travel, he was starting more churches, and some people showed up in Corinth while he was away. And when they showed up, they said, hey, we're representatives of the church. And as we listened to what Paul taught you Paul was wrong. And we have the real gospel. They came with letters of recommendations. And the believers in Corinth were a little confused. What do we do? Paul taught us one way, and these guys showing up with these letters of recommendation are telling us that it's okay to live a different way. And so they went out to find Paul and ask him for some advice. What should they do? And Paul sent back a letter. That letter is what we refer to as 2 Corinthians, the letter that our passage comes from today. In that letter, in the portion that we're looking at, Paul insisted that you can tell when someone has the real gospel. Their lives are changed. Paul insisted that a changed life of those that he had discipled while he was in Corinth were really his letter of recommendation. Paul said that we wrote these letters that you already have because you have them on your hearts, and we wrote them from our hearts, which seems sort of like a strange way to talk about writing a letter, because we rarely write things on our heart. We write them on paper, we write them on stone, we write them in clay, we write them in books, we write them on our tablets. We don't tend to think about impressing things on a heart. But it was Paul's way of saying, hey, when we were there and we gave you the good news about Jesus, that good news changed your life. It's the same good news that changed our life. We're just passing it along to you. And you can tell whether our gospel is the true gospel or these new people's gospel by looking and saying, is your life changed for the better? If these new people who were teaching something different weren't helping you, weren't leading you to good changes, then you need to recognize that it's false. And by the way, if you didn't know, the false gospel that was being taught by these leaders that showed up in ancient Corinth were giving people, these believers in Corinth, to act and behave and talk in ways that the gospel would not lead us to do. It was allowing them to be judgmental, and it was allowing them to be harsh. It was allowing them to be works-oriented rather than being grace and merciful-oriented. But the change in their lives when they encountered the true gospel that Paul preached to them, Paul says that change you experienced was real. That it wasn't a secret change. Usually when we get changed by Christ, we can't hide it. That letter of recommendation is evident for everyone to see us. And people are reading you, whether they are friends or foes. They are looking to see if the gospel has made any difference in your life whatsoever. And they're not necessarily doing it to judge you. They're just doing it to say, I'm kind of watching to see if it really works with you. And if it really works with you, I might give it a try because I want change. But I don't want to try it if the change doesn't happen. So recognizing this real gospel is real simple. The true gospel changes things for the better. While their lives changing for the better served as this letter of recommendation that Paul had shared the true gospel with them, it also ultimately recommends Christ as the one who can change lives. What we hear today that there's no possibility of changing is just a lie. These believers in ancient Corinth, when they heard the gospel, when they believed it and embraced it, when they repented of their sins and the behaviors of how they formerly lived, when they made their confession and were baptized and were filled with the Holy Spirit, they got sent off in a new, different direction than they had been before. It's getting close already, thinking about homecoming times. And man, I've never been to a homecoming where I went to high school. And Marcy and I were talking about it recently, and she'd like, we ought to go to that sometime because everybody's going to see you. They're going to go, you became a what? You're a preacher? Really? How'd that happen? Our changed lives really are a letter of recommendation, as Paul said. And it's not a letter that's written with ink. It's not one that's even put in wax. It's not chiseled into stone. It's written by the Spirit of the living God on our hearts. The reason their lives commended Christ is because they had changed. He does the impossible. It wasn't Paul. And, none of us ever save someone. It's Christ who saves them. It's Christ who wipes away their sin. It's Christ who restores their relationship with God. It's Christ who fills them with His Spirit. It's Christ who sends them in a new direction with purpose and power. It's Christ who gives us the hope of heaven. A false gospel can't change anything. A false gospel makes people's stories worse rather than better. It's only the true gospel, Christ's good news about what He does, that is good news. Paul's description of the Spirit of God riding upon a fleshy heart instead of a heart of stone echoes a story that you might be familiar with, but maybe not from an adult perspective. It's a story that's found in Ezekiel whenever Ezekiel was being used by God to reclaim His people. And just in case you're wondering, your English text, like mine, probably uses the term human heart in it in Corinthians, but it's a Greek word that says fleshly, and it's the equivalent of the Hebrew word that Ezekiel used in describing the heart, which is fleshy. In chapter 36 of Ezekiel, beginning in chapter 16 and following, the Lord, speaking through Ezekiel, is telling His people Israel that they had defiled the land that He had given them by their words and their deeds. And He used the term that means defile, that means that when someone has something going on in their life that might be a danger, a health danger to someone else in the community, that's when they would call them defiled. And we would have to then separate you from everyone else so you don't get everyone else sick. We sort of understand that today, right? We've been doing that for a few years. They had a lot of understandings that God has given them, like, hey, if someone encounters a dead person and they're around them, they need to be separated from the community for a while to make sure they didn't pick up something before they can come back in. If you've been around an issue of blood, then you need to separate yourself a while before you come back in. If you've had certain diseases or certain skin conditions and the like, you need to sort of separate yourself so you don't get everybody else sick. But once it's evidence that you no longer pose a health threat, once you're clean, then you can return into the community. In this sense, a priest sort of action like the CDC or a doctor, and they would be the ones who would have to say, yeah, you meet the clean conditions, come back in. And that's why it's usually called ritually clean. So it wasn't like some service down at church. It was just, hey, in Leviticus, we have this code that tells us what's clean and what's not clean, and what could be harmful to us and what's not harmful to us. And in particular, in this portion of God talking to His people, Ezekiel compares Israel, and I don't want to be too coarse, but this is going to be more of a discussion in adult, because these are the words that are actually in the Bible. He compares Israel to a woman who had become defiled, that is unclean, because of her regular menstruation. You think about it for a second. We get compared to lots of things. This is not one you usually hear about at church. It's not the subject that we normally talk about, but it is something we all understand and relate to. So bear with me for a little bit as I carry out what Ezekiel was telling Israel. Menstruation is a sign that pregnancy did not occur, right? That's what that is. When a woman has that cycle, it means she didn't get pregnant. For whatever reasons, it's not a necessarily bad thing, but that's a sign. You didn't get pregnant. That's why there's this issue of blood and tissue. The woman, under their times, then would be separated from the community for a while. She would be cleansed after her time was over, and then she would be able to be brought back in just to make sure that in that process, something didn't happen that might get communicated to someone else. Ezekiel used this adult image to indicate that Israel, spiritually speaking, had not become pregnant while living in God's land. That is, they had not received his word as a seed into their life that would make them fruitful. Spiritually speaking, God's word is often equated with a seed that is planted in our lives in which we become fruitful. And the Israelites had not become pregnant, because instead of turning to God and receiving his seed, they had turned to idols and had received an idol's seed. And an idol seed can't produce life. Ezekiel pointed out that idols cannot do what God's word can do when it comes to making someone spiritually pregnant. The evidence of Israel not receiving what God would have given them is that they shed blood on the land. This ministration of blood was equivalent to how they were acting and what they were saying as a result of taking the advice of those who were involved in idol worship. Now you need to understand that idol worship wasn't about going to a service somewhere. It was about taking the advice of those who led that worship on the way you would live your life, the choices that you would make, how you would treat people, how you would act, what was okay and what wasn't okay. And these idols were giving permission to God's people to live in ways that God has said, I don't want you doing that. If you do this, it's going to harm you. If you do this, it's going to harm the people around you. And since they rejected God's word, they weren't becoming pregnant with it, and they're receiving the idol's word, which couldn't make them pregnant. And all it did was ruin their story. God said, hey, you idol-worshiping children of mine, you Israelites, you're going to have to leave the land that I gave to you. And you're going to have to go into the land where those people are now living that we chased out of the land that I gave to you. So think about that for a minute. It's as if God was saying, so you want to live like everybody else? You want to be an idol worshiper and look like everybody else? Then you leave my land and you go live in their land where you can look like everybody else. And whenever the Israelites arrived in that new land, those people who were watching them come said, hey, there's God's people. And they've come out of his land. They weren't talking about changing location. They were talking about they were no longer living by God's rules. They were no longer acting like God's people. They'd come out of it. Kind of like people saying, hey, I don't live like the church anymore. I've come out of it so I can live like everybody else in the world. And they ended up with the same problems as everybody else in the world. Israel was welcomed by the world one of a few times because they were just acting like everybody else. As a result of their continued behavior that looked like everyone else, this inability to be pregnant with God's way of doing things, and having a regular issue of blood that resulted from their idol-informed decisions and behaviors, God's name was profaned everywhere they went. So think of it this way. When someone knows that you're a Christian, and they notice that you don't act any different than anyone else, and you end up with the same sort of problems that everybody else has, you drag God's name through the dirt, because God says, I change people. Their lives are better when they follow me. And they're going to be looking at you and saying, if that's someone who loves the Lord, if that's someone who's following God, and they're no different than anybody else, then who needs God like that? There's no real promise of change there. But this wasn't the end of Israel's story, was it? Like the woman who leaves and then is brought back in when they're cleansed, Ezekiel said, God is going to make his name holy again by changing you and cleansing you so that you can come back as his people into his land. So that's exactly what God did. He said, you're going to come back, and since you'll be clean, and you've already had that time out there, you're going to be ready to obey. You're going to be ready to be my people. You've probably heard these words before, because we sometimes quote them, although we don't do them in context. This is verse 25 of Ezekiel 36. It's the proclamation of the change that God promised to these idol-worshiping Israelites of his who needed some hope of a changed life. God said, I'm going to pour clean water on you, and you are going to be clean. I will cleanse you from all of your filthiness and from all of your idols. Moreover, I'm going to give you a new heart, and I'm going to put a new spirit within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will be real careful to observe my ordinances. You will live in the land that I gave your forefathers again, so that you will be my people, and I will be your God. The dramatically changed lives for the better of these Israelites became a living letter to the nations with whom they had been living. And many of those nations were looking at them and the changes that were taking place and the land that was restored to them and the blessings that started happening in them. And they're like, can we get some of that? And that's really what happens when people look at us. When we tell people that we're a Christian, our changed life, or the lack thereof, might determine whether they decide to give this Christian thing a try or not. And most people, because of that part of the story, they don't want anyone to know about the pain and the sorrow, the result of those behaviors they can't seem to stop. They want that change. They want what we proclaim that we have. And they want to know, is it real? Can God really make a difference? They want to know if they can become that tabula rasa. Man, I've got so much going on. Can he really wipe it clean? And they look at us and say, can I really write a new story, better story? And the answer is yes. I'm going to invite the worship team to begin coming up as we close. I want to challenge you that the next time you see a blank piece of paper, whether it's in the locker or whether it's an electronic one on your screen, I want you to let it remind you that God can wipe your slate clean. And that on that letter, He is going to be writing a love letter on it to the people around you. The choices you make, the words you use, they're all going to be recorded on that blank page, revealing how you've been changed by the grace of God. If you've messed up, He will make that blank slate again. If you mess up again, He will cleanse it again. You know how many times those students took those wax tablets in? Every day. Every day they had to be cleaned. And sometimes every day we need that same promise. And God is faithful to keep giving us a clean tablet so that we can begin finally writing that better story. And so I want to challenge you to let God help you be the person He has made you to be. Would you stand as we sing?